The day he became a billionaire. He wasn't thinking about the money. He was thinking about a widow next door, who once split her children's last meal in half, so he wouldn't go to bed hungry. He was 17. His father had just died. His mother was slowly fatting, and she was the only one who helped. That night, through tears, he made a promise. If I ever make it, I'll come back for you. 20 years passed. He built an empire, but he never found her, until the day fate collapsed at his feet. On a construction site he almost didn't visit. And what he discovered would test whether a promise made in poverty still mattered in wealth. If you believe kindness always comes back, then stay with me until the end of this story. And if stories like this still move your heart, make sure you subscribe, because this channel is for people who still believe character matters more than money. The helicopter blades slowed as it descended onto the private landing pad behind the mansion. From above, the estate looked like something out of a luxury magazine: white stone walls, glass balconies reflecting the afternoon sun, fountains sculpted from imported Italian marble. The driveway curved in a perfect crescent, lined with manicured hedges trimmed with mathematical precision. 3 black luxury vehicles waited near the entrance, engines humming quietly. Inside the mansion, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked acres of landscaped gardens. A long dining table carved from rare walnut stretched beneath a chandelier that sparkled like captured starlight. The walls carried modern art worth more than most homes. And at the head of it all stood Daniel Carter, billionaire, founder of multiple companies, a logistics, tech infrastructure, renewable energy. His name appeared on magazine covers. Business schools studied his leadership. Investors followed his moves like prophecy. Yet on this particular afternoon, Daniel wasn't thinking about quarterly profits or acquisitions. He stood alone in his private office on the top floor of his corporate headquarters, a 40-story building bearing his name in polished steel letters. Carter Global Holdings. The office was expansive and immaculate. A mahogany desk, minimalist decor framed awards from decades of success. Behind him, glass walls revealed a city skyline stretching endlessly, proof of achievement. But his eyes weren't on the skyline. They were on something small. An old creased photograph resting in his palm. The photo was faded, edges worn, a modest little house in the background, a skinny teenage boy standing beside a woman with tired but gentle eyes. Daniel swallowed. 20 years. 20 years since he had seen that house. 20 years since life had broken him open. 20 years earlier. He had been 17 when the police knocked on their door. It was a rainy Thursday evening. He remembered the sound clearly, rain tapping against the tin gutter, the distant rumble of thunder. His father had left that morning for work like he always did. He never came back. A highway accident. A drunk driver. Instant impact. Instant death. The words felt unreal when the officer said them, like someone describing another family, another tragedy. His mother's scream was something Daniel would never forget. It wasn't loud. It was hollow, like something inside her had collapsed permanently. The funeral passed in a blur. Neighbors brought casseroles. People said, "If you need anything, just call." Most of them never called again. Within months, the real storm began. His mother stopped sleeping, stopped eating properly. Stress turned into chest pains turned into hospital visits. Tests revealed severe heart complications aggravated by trauma and untreated hypertension. Medical bills stacked up like a cruel tower. Insurance covered almost nothing. Daniel watched the hospital monitors beep beside his mother's fragile body and felt something shift inside him. He couldn't be a child anymore. 2 weeks before senior year resumed, he packed his textbooks into a cardboard box. He didn't make a speech. He didn't tell many people. He simply didn't return. Instead, he found work. Construction sites, warehouse shifts, night cleaning jobs. Anything. His hands, once soft from school notebooks, became calloused and cracked. He learned how to mix cement, carry bricks, lift loads heavier than his own body weight. Most nights he returned home exhausted, clothes covered in dust, hands shaking from fatigue. The refrigerator was often nearly empty. Sometimes there would be bread. Sometimes just tap water. He learned how to lie gently. "I already ate at work, Mom." She would look at him knowing. But she would pretend to believe him. There were days he went 24 hours without a full meal. He remembered one winter evening vividly. He had $3 left in his pocket. Enough for one cheap sandwich. He bought it. He cut it in half before entering the house. Then when his mother insisted she wasn't hungry, he lied again. "I had two at work." That night after she fell asleep, his stomach growled so loudly it echoed in the silent room. He pressed a pillow against his abdomen and closed his eyes. Hunger wasn't the worst part. Humiliation was. Former classmates would sometimes see him working construction. "Didn't you used to be top of the class?" He would smile faintly. Life changes. They didn't see him after work sitting beside his mother's hospital bed, reading medication instructions carefully so he wouldn't mess up dosages. They didn't see him calculating which bill could wait and which couldn't. They didn't see him crying quietly in the bathroom so she wouldn't hear. He was 17. And already tired in ways most people never understand. Back in the present, Daniel placed the old photograph gently onto his desk. On another table across the room sat framed magazine covers. Self-made billionaire under 40. From nothing to empire. Visionary of the decade. People loved that phrase. From nothing. But they didn't know what nothing actually felt like. Nothing felt like watching your mother ration her medication because you couldn't afford the refill yet. Nothing felt like turning off lights to save electricity and pretending it was romantic candlelight. Nothing felt like hunger twisting your insides while telling the person you love most that you're full. Daniel walked toward the glass wall of his office and stared at the city below. Traffic moved. People rushed. Deals were being signed. Money was flowing. He had everything now. Private jets. Multiple estates. Companies employing thousands. But as the afternoon sunlight reflected against the skyscrapers, one thought echoed louder than all the success surrounding him. There had been someone. Someone who had stepped into their darkness when everyone else stepped away. Someone who had given when she barely had anything. He closed his eyes. He could still see her face. And he whispered softly to the empty office. "I never forgot." Back then their house sat at the very edge of the neighborhood. Paint peeling, fence slightly tilted, grass uneven. It wasn't much. But it was home. And next door lived the woman who would unknowingly shape Daniel's entire life. Her name was Margaret Hale. She was 45 years old. Recently widowed. Her husband, Thomas Hale, had passed away from a sudden stroke barely 8 months before Daniel's father died. One tragedy had quietly followed another on that street. Margaret was left alone with 2 little boys. Ethan, 6 years old. Noah, 4 years old. 2 small children who still asked at night, "When is Daddy coming home?" She didn't have the heart to answer them properly every time. Margaret survived on a modest life insurance payout that barely stretched and a part-time job at a local grocery store where she worked early morning shifts stocking shelves before sunrise. When she returned home, she would clean, cook, stretch every dollar like it was elastic. Her hands were always busy. Her eyes were always tired. But her heart, still soft. She first noticed Daniel one evening when she saw him coming home from work. He looked older than 17. Dust-covered boots, shoulders slumped, shirt clinging to his back with sweat, but what struck her most wasn't exhaustion. It was the silence. Teenage boys usually carried noise with them, laughter, frustration, music. Daniel carried something heavier. Grief. Margaret had learned to recognize it. She walked over one afternoon with a small container of chicken soup. "Made too much," she said gently. It wasn't true. She had made just enough. But she stretched it. Daniel hesitated before accepting it. His pride already forming walls. "Thank you, ma'am." "Call me Margaret," she replied with a small smile. That night, for the first time in weeks, he and his mother ate something warm. Margaret didn't stop there. Every few days she would knock softly. Sometimes with bread, sometimes with leftover pasta. Sometimes with fruit she bought on discount. always saying we had extra. They never had extra. But she never let them feel like a burden. Daniel began noticing something. Every time she brought food, her boys weren't with her. One evening, curiosity led him to step outside earlier than usual. Through the thin kitchen window of Margaret's house, he saw something that would mark him forever. The kitchen light was dim. Margaret stood at the small wooden table. On it sat a single plate of rice, mixed with a few vegetables. Not much. Ethan and Noah sat opposite her. Ethan asked quietly, "Mommy, is that all?" Margaret knelt in front of them. She smiled the kind of smile that hides sacrifice. "Tonight we're going to do something special." The boys looked confused. She divided the small portion into 2 even smaller plates. Then paused. She looked at what remained, barely enough for half a child's meal. She closed her eyes briefly. Then she split that portion into 2 again. 4 plates now. Tiny. She placed 2 plates in front of her boys. Then scooped the remaining 2 into a container. Noah frowned. "But Mommy, what about you?" She kissed his forehead. "I already ate at work." "A lie. A gentle one." Then she added softly, "Remember what Daddy used to say, when you share, God multiplies." Daniel felt his throat tighten. Margaret took the container, grabbed her coat and stepped outside. Daniel quickly moved back toward his own house so she wouldn't know he had seen. Moments later she knocked. When he opened the door, she smiled like always. "Made a little extra tonight." He stared at the container. He knew. She hadn't made extra. She had divided survival into pieces. Behind him, his mother coughed weakly from the couch. Margaret stepped in gently and handed her the food. "Just something small," she said casually. Daniel's hands trembled. He couldn't speak. After she left, he sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the food. His mother looked at him. "What's wrong?" He swallowed hard. She gave us her food." Tears began falling before he could stop them. For weeks he had fought hunger quietly. But this was different. This was someone else choosing hunger for them. That night he couldn't sleep. The image replayed in his mind, Margaret kneeling before her sons, dividing almost nothing into something for others. The next evening, when she came by again with bread and peanut butter, Daniel stepped outside before she could knock. He stood in front of her, eyes already wet. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. She looked surprised. "Doing what?" "We're not your responsibility." She studied him for a long moment. Then she said something he would never forget. "When my husband died, I thought I was alone in the world. Then I realized grief doesn't compare stories, pain doesn't compete, we just help each other carry it." His voice broke. "I saw you last night." Her eyes flickered. "You didn't have enough." She didn't deny it. Instead she said gently, "Daniel, sometimes when you give your last, it reminds you that you still have something no one can take, kindness." He began to cry openly now. Not the silent tears he hid from his mother. Real shaking sobs. Margaret stepped forward and placed her hand on his shoulder. He looked at her and said words that came from somewhere deep, somewhere raw. "I don't know how and I don't know when, but if I ever become successful, if I ever have more than enough, I will never forget you. I promise you, I'll take care of you and your boys." Margaret smiled softly. Not because she expected anything, but because she believed in him. "I don't need you to be rich, Daniel," she said. "Just be good, that's enough." But he shook his head. "No, I mean it, I won't forget." She looked at him with something almost motherly in her eyes. "I know." Inside her house that night, Ethan asked, "Mommy, why do we share when we don't have much?" Margaret tucked him into bed and answered softly, "Because one day, someone will remember." 20 years later. In a glass office high above a city skyline, Daniel Carter sat alone in silence. He could still see that tiny kitchen. Still hear the scraping of a spoon against a nearly empty plate. Still remember the way she smiled while choosing less for herself. He had searched for her at first. But life moved quickly. Success came fast and heavy. New cities, new responsibilities, new battles. Neighbors had told him years ago. They moved away. No one knew where. Now, sitting in his office, billionaire status wrapped around him like armor, Daniel leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. "Where are you, Margaret?" he whispered. Because no matter how much money he had built, there was a debt in his heart that interest could not calculate. The day Daniel's mother died, the sky was painfully clear. No rain. No storm. No dramatic thunder. Just quiet blue, the kind that feels unfair when your world is falling apart. Her breathing had been weaker that morning. He had noticed it while adjusting her pillow. "Mom, do you want some water?" he asked gently. She smiled faintly, her lips were dry, her hands thinner than he remembered. "You've done enough," she whispered. He didn't understand what she meant. He was 17. He still believed effort could outwork fate. The ambulance arrived too late. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and endings. Machines beeped in uneven rhythm. A nurse placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry." 2 words that feel like a door slamming shut forever. Daniel stood there long after the machines were turned off. He didn't cry immediately. He just stared at her face, memorizing it. Because he knew this was the last time he would see it. He didn't know who called Margaret. He didn't remember dialing anyone. But somehow she arrived. She walked into that hospital room quietly, her coat still on, hair slightly messy as if she had rushed. When she saw Daniel standing there frozen beside the bed, her eyes filled instantly. She didn't say "I'm sorry." She simply opened her arms. And for the first time since his father died, Daniel allowed himself to collapse. He sobbed against her shoulder like a child. Not a worker. Not a provider. Not a man carrying responsibility. Just a son who had lost his mother. Margaret held him tightly. "I'm here," she whispered. 3 words he desperately needed. The days after the funeral were worse than the day itself. The house felt too quiet. The chair his mother used sat empty. Her favorite blanket still draped over the couch. Daniel would wake up in the middle of the night expecting to hear her cough. Silence answered him every time. Margaret began stopping by more frequently. Not with speeches. Not with pity. But with presence. She helped sort through medical bills. She helped him cancel unnecessary utilities. She brought groceries without making it obvious. She sent Ethan and Noah over sometimes, their innocent laughter breaking the heavy atmosphere inside his home. One evening, Daniel sat on the porch steps staring at nothing. Margaret sat beside him. For a long time neither spoke. Then she said gently, "Grief doesn't leave quickly, it just changes shape." He swallowed hard. "I feel empty." She nodded. "That's because you gave everything to take care of her. Now your body doesn't know what to do without that purpose." He hadn't thought about it that way. For 2 years, his life had revolved around survival for his mother. Now survival felt pointless. "Why does it feel like I failed?" he whispered. Margaret turned toward him. "You didn't fail. I couldn't save her. You loved her, you worked for her, you sacrificed for her. That is not failure." Her voice grew firmer. "That is honor." The word struck him deeply. Honor. No one had framed his suffering that way before. Weeks passed. The bills continued. Without his mother's small disability assistance check, the financial pressure tightened. The house was too expensive for one teenager to maintain. Daniel began applying for jobs outside town, bigger opportunities, better pay. He didn't tell Margaret at first, but she sensed it. One afternoon, she found him packing a small duffel bag. "You're leaving," she said softly. He nodded. "I have to, there's nothing left for me here." Her eyes glistened not from selfishness but from understanding. "When?" "Tomorrow morning." The room felt heavier. Ethan and Noah were playing in the corner with toy cars, unaware that another goodbye was forming. Margaret stepped closer. "Come sit with me," she said. They sat at the small kitchen table, the same one where she had once divided her last meal. Daniel looked around slowly. This house had held him together when his own fell apart. "I don't know if I'll make it," he admitted quietly. Margaret reached across the table and held his hands. "You will." "How do you know?" "Because I've watched you choose responsibility over comfort. That kind of character doesn't lose." Tears filled his eyes again. "I won't forget you," he said, voice shaking. when I make something of myself, I'll come back. I promise I'll take care of you and the boys." Margaret stood. She walked around the table and placed both hands on his head gently, almost like a mother blessing her child. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "May God protect your steps. May doors open where walls stand. May your hands never be empty. And may your heart never forget where it came from." Tears streamed down his face. She pulled him into a tight embrace. "You already are rich in the only way that matters," she whispered. The next morning before sunrise, Daniel stood at the edge of town with a single bag and a bus ticket. Margaret and her boys stood beside him. Ethan hugged him first. "Are you coming back soon?" Daniel forced a smile. "Soon." Noah held onto his leg. Margaret gently pulled her youngest back and looked Daniel in the eyes one last time. "Go build your life," she said. "Don't look back with fear, only with gratitude." The bus doors opened. Daniel stepped inside. As it pulled away, he watched her grow smaller through the window. A widow. 2 little boys. Standing on cracked pavement. Waving. He pressed his hand against the glass. And whispered, "I'll come back." Present day. Daniel sat in his high-rise office, the memory playing like a film behind his eyes. He had meant every word. But life had moved fast. First job turned into opportunity. Opportunity turned into partnership. Partnership turned into breakthrough. Years blurred into expansion, mergers, board meetings, travel. At first, he sent letters back to the old address. They were returned. He called the last number he had. Disconnected. Eventually, when he visited the neighborhood years later, the house had new owners. "They moved away," someone said casually. No forwarding address. No contact. Just gone. Now, 20 years later, regret settled heavier than any financial loss he had ever experienced. He had built empires. But he had not kept his promise. He stood suddenly from his desk. Impulse rising. He needed to see the neighborhood again. Needed to try one more time. The next morning, Daniel drove himself, no driver, no entourage, back to the street where his story began. The houses looked different. Fresh paint. New fences. Old trees taller. But Margaret's house. It wasn't hers anymore. He knocked on the door. A stranger answered. "Excuse me," Daniel asked, voice tight. "Do you know what happened to the previous owner, Margaret Hale?" The woman frowned. "We bought this place about 15 years ago, don't know much about the family before." He walked up and down the street asking neighbors. Some had moved in recently. Others shrugged. "No idea. It's been a long time. People move on." Move on. The phrase stung. Daniel stood in the middle of the sidewalk as evening light stretched long shadows across the pavement. 20 years. And he had no idea where the woman who fed him with her last meal was. He closed his eyes. "I should have tried harder," he whispered to himself. For the first time in decades, the billionaire felt powerless. Not because of markets. Not because of competition. But because he had lost the trail of the one person he owed everything to. And somewhere without him knowing. Life had not been kind to her. When Margaret Hale left that neighborhood, it wasn't by choice. It was survival. 2 years after Daniel boarded that bus and disappeared toward a bigger future, the grocery store where she worked closed down, corporate restructuring, cost efficiency, that's what the letter had said. Her small income vanished overnight. The insurance money from her late husband had long been exhausted. Rent, food, school clothes, medical bills, utilities. Every dollar had stretched until it could stretch no more. The landlord raised the rent. She tried negotiating. He refused. So one quiet weekend, Margaret packed their lives into a rented truck. Ethan was 8. Noah was 6. They didn't understand why they had to leave. "Are we coming back?" Noah asked, holding onto his worn teddy bear. Margaret forced a smile. "Sometimes God moves us before we're ready," she said softly. They relocated to a smaller town nearly 3 states away, a place where rent was cheaper, jobs were scarce, and hope was something you built slowly with tired hands. The new apartment was smaller. 2 bedrooms. Peeling wallpaper. Thin walls where you could hear neighbors argue at night. But Margaret made it home. She always did. The years were not kind. She worked 2 jobs. Morning cleaning offices. Evening shifts at a diner. Her hands grew rougher. Her back began to ache constantly. But she never complained in front of her boys. Ethan and Noah grew into young men watching their mother sacrifice daily. They saw her skip meals, saw her hide overdue notices, saw her collapse into bed past midnight and wake before sunrise. Ethan matured early, protective, quiet. Noah carried a softer heart like hers. They both studied hard at first, Margaret insisted. Education, she would say, is something no one can repossess. But when Ethan turned 18, college felt impossible. Financial aid covered little. Margaret insisted he go anyway. He tried. He lasted 1 semester before dropping out to work full-time because rent was behind. Noah followed 2 years later. "I'll go back someday," he promised her. She knew he was lying for her comfort. Still she nodded. "Someday," she repeated. Then, at 65, Margaret began feeling tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. At first she ignored it. Just age, she thought. Then came the abdominal pain. Persistent, sharp. She hid it for weeks. Until one morning at the diner she dropped a tray. The crash echoed through the restaurant. Her vision blurred. The manager rushed over. "You need to see a doctor." She resisted. Doctors meant bills. Bills meant fear. But Ethan insisted. "Mom, please." The hospital room smelled like old memories. The tests took days. Then the oncologist called them in. Ethan and Noah sat on either side of their mother. The doctor's expression was careful, measured. "I'm very sorry," he began. Margaret felt it before he said it. Stage 3 pancreatic cancer. Aggressive. Advanced. Silence swallowed the room. Noah's fingers tightened around the chair. Ethan stared straight ahead, jaw locked. "What are the options?" Ethan asked, voice barely steady. The doctor inhaled slowly. "Surgery immediately, followed by chemotherapy. Without surgery, progression will be rapid." "How much?" Noah asked quietly. The doctor hesitated. "With hospitalization, surgery, post-operative care, you're looking at approximately $180,000 to $220,000. The number echoed like a gunshot. They didn't have $2,000 in savings. Margaret looked at her sons, and for the first time in years she looked afraid. The months that followed were brutal. Ethan worked construction during the day and drove for a delivery service at night. Noah worked at a warehouse and picked up shifts at a gas station. They slept 4 hours on good days. Still, hospital bills stacked up. Pain medication alone cost hundreds weekly. Margaret lost weight quickly. Her once steady voice weakened. Sometimes, late at night, she would whisper prayers when she thought her sons were asleep. "Lord, just give them strength, even if you don't heal me, protect them." The boys heard. They always heard. They tried everything. Community fundraisers. Online donation pages. Church appeals. They applied for medical loans. Denied. No collateral. No strong credit history. No assets. One bank officer even said bluntly, "I'm sorry, but this is too high risk." High risk. As if their mother's life was an investment portfolio. Margaret's condition worsened. The cancer spread faster than predicted. Her skin grew pale. Her hands trembled. She struggled to eat. One afternoon, the doctor asked to speak with Ethan and Noah privately. They stood in the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. "I want to be honest with you," the doctor said gently. "If surgery is not performed within the next few weeks, your mother may have less than a month." Less than a month. Noah felt his knees weaken. Ethan caught him. "She has maybe 10 to 14 days before we reach a critical stage," the doctor added softly. The world went quiet. 10 days. They walked back into the room. Margaret was resting, eyes closed, breathing shallow. Noah stepped outside and punched the hospital wall until his knuckles bled. Ethan leaned against the corridor, sliding down slowly until he was sitting on the cold tile floor. "I can't lose her," Noah whispered. Ethan's voice cracked for the first time in years. "We won't." but neither of them knew how. They returned home that night to an apartment with overdue notices taped to the door. The electricity had almost been disconnected. The refrigerator was nearly empty. Noah opened it. 1 carton of milk. Half a loaf of bread. Some medication. He closed it slowly. "I'm not hungry," he said. Ethan nodded. "Me neither." Another lie. History repeating itself in a way they didn't even recognize. Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness over the next few days. Sometimes she would whisper her son's names. Sometimes she would stare blankly at the ceiling. One evening she grabbed Ethan's hand weakly. If something happens." "Don't," he interrupted. "Listen to me," she insisted softly. "Take care of your brother." Tears streamed down his face. "You're not going anywhere." She smiled faintly. "I've had a good life because of you boys." Noah stepped closer, unable to breathe properly. "Mom, please." She squeezed their hands. "You remember what I always told you." They nodded through tears. "When you share, God multiplies." Her voice was barely audible now. 10 days left. That was what the doctor had said. And they had nothing left to sell. Nothing left to borrow. Nothing left to give. Except their labor. The next morning, exhausted and emotionally shattered, Ethan and Noah reported to a new construction site across state lines, a massive corporate project that promised slightly higher pay. They didn't know who owned it. They didn't care. They just needed money. Even if it was too late. They worked on empty stomachs. On broken hope. With the clock ticking louder than ever. Neither of them knew that fate, quiet, patient fate, was already moving. And that somewhere, a billionaire was about to follow an urge he could not explain. Daniel Carter did not usually visit construction sites. That was what executives were for. By now, his companies operated like well-oiled machines. Reports were delivered in polished presentations. Inspections were handled by trusted senior managers. His time was scheduled months ahead. But this project felt different. Carter Global Holdings was building an ultra-modern manufacturing and logistics facility in another state, a massive expansion project projected to employ over 2,000 people once completed. Steel beams stretched into the sky, concrete foundations spread across acres, cranes moved rhythmically against the morning sun. Daniel had already received the inspection report. Everything was on schedule. Everything was excellent. He should have stayed in his office. But that morning, something restless stirred inside him. He stood by the window of his mansion before sunrise, staring at the horizon. Margaret's face had been on his mind all night. The blessing she spoke over him. The kitchen table. The divided meal. He couldn't shake it. At 12 minutes past 7 in the morning, he called his executive vice president. "I'm coming to the site today." A pause. "Sir, that's not necessary. We've already done a full walkthrough. We'll send you." "I'll come," Daniel repeated calmly. Another pause. "Yes, sir." He didn't know why he insisted. He only knew that something in him refused to ignore the urge. Meanwhile, across state lines, Ethan and Noah Hale woke before dawn. Neither had slept much. Their mother had barely responded the previous night. The doctor's words echoed again. 10 days. Maybe less. Ethan splashed cold water on his face in the cracked bathroom sink. Noah stood in the kitchen, staring into the empty refrigerator. They hadn't eaten dinner. There was no time for breakfast. "We'll grab something later," Ethan muttered. They both knew that meant nothing. On the drive to the construction site, silence filled the car. After weeks of loan rejections, charity denials, and desperate phone calls, hope had become fragile. Noah finally spoke. What if we lose her?" Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter. "We won't." But his voice didn't carry conviction anymore. The site was massive. Hundreds of workers. The air filled with dust and the sharp clang of metal. Manual labor was grueling, but the pay was slightly better than their previous job. They needed every dollar. Even if it was too late. Ethan carried steel rods under the mid-morning sun. Sweat soaked through his shirt, his back ached from lack of rest. Noah worked mixing cement near the far end of the foundation area. His stomach twisted painfully. He hadn't eaten in nearly 24 hours. The world around him began to blur. The noise felt distant. He blinked hard. The sun seemed too bright. He tried to steady himself by gripping the wheelbarrow. It slipped. The ground tilted. And then, darkness. At that exact moment, a convoy of black vehicles rolled onto the site. Executives stepped out first, adjusting suits and scanning the area. Then Daniel exited the final car. Hard hat handed to him. Dust rising around polished shoes. He walked forward, surveying the progress. Steel framework, structural integrity, concrete curing patterns. He was mid-sentence asking about delivery timelines when a shout pierced through the noise. Someone collapsed. Workers rushed toward the cement area. Daniel instinctively turned. A young man lay motionless on the ground. Another man, slightly older, frantic, knelt beside him. Noah. Daniel didn't think. Call the on-site medical team, he ordered immediately. Within minutes, paramedics stationed for site safety arrived with equipment. They checked pulse. Weak. Low blood pressure. Severe dehydration, one medic muttered, possibly hypoglycemia. Daniel watched closely. Something about the older brother's desperation struck him. The way he held the unconscious young man. The fear in his voice. It felt familiar. Too familiar. Noah gasped as oxygen mask was placed over his face. Slowly his eyes fluttered open. Ethan exhaled shakily, gripping his brother's hand. Daniel stepped closer. What happened? He asked calmly. Ethan stood quickly, embarrassed. Just he hasn't been eating properly, he admitted quietly. Daniel studied him. There was something in his eyes. Pain layered over pride. I'll cover his medical expenses, Daniel said without hesitation. Make sure he's stabilized. Ethan froze. That's not necessary, sir. It is, Daniel replied firmly. He turned to the medic. Run full tests. As Noah was helped to sit up, Daniel crouched slightly to his level. What's your name? He asked gently. Noah removed the oxygen mask slowly. Noah. The name hit Daniel like a distant echo. Noah. His heartbeat quickened. And yours? Daniel asked, looking at the older brother. Ethan. The world seemed to narrow. Daniel felt something shift inside him. Your last name? He asked, voice almost too steady. Ethan hesitated. Hale. The sound of it was electric. Daniel's chest tightened. Hale. He swallowed. Margaret Hale is she. Ethan's face changed instantly. How do you know our mothers? The air between them thickened. Daniel's hands trembled slightly. He hadn't spoken her name out loud in years. I used to live next door to her, he said slowly, 20 years ago. Ethan stared. Noah blinked, confused. Daniel continued, voice shaking now. She had 2 little boys, Ethan and Noah. Silence. The construction noise faded into the background. Ethan stepped back slightly. You're Daniel, he asked carefully. Daniel felt tears sting unexpectedly. Yes. Noah's eyes widened as memory flickered faintly. Mom used to talk about someone, he whispered weakly, a boy she helped. Ethan's breath caught. She always said one day he'd come back. Daniel's vision blurred. For 20 years he had searched. And now, they were standing in front of him. On his construction site. Hungry. Exhausted. Broken by the same cycle he once lived through. What's wrong? Daniel asked urgently. Why hasn't he been eating? Ethan's composure finally cracked. Our mom has stage 3 pancreatic cancer, he said hoarsely. Surgery costs over $200,000. We've been trying to raise money. She has maybe 10 days left. The word shattered something inside Daniel. 10 days. History repeating itself. Another mother slipping away because of money. Because of lack. Because of time. He felt 17 again. Standing beside a hospital bed. Powerless. But this time, he wasn't powerless. He stood up slowly. Voice firm. Take me to her. Ethan and Noah stared at him in disbelief. I don't understand, Ethan whispered. Daniel looked at them with tears openly falling now. You once had a mother who split her last meal to feed me, he said. Now it's my turn. The wind moved across the construction site. Steel beams cast long shadows. And for the first time in 20 years, the promise he made as a broken 17-year-old boy was standing directly in front of him. Alive. Waiting. Daniel didn't return to his car. He didn't finish the inspection. He didn't take another business call. For the first time in decades, nothing about expansion plans, shareholders, or deadlines mattered. He turned to his executive team. Clear my schedule indefinitely. Sir, we have the... Clear it, he repeated. They had never seen him like this. Not emotional. Not shaken. Not human in this way. Within 20 minutes, Daniel's private medical transport team was mobilized. Within an hour, he was sitting in the back of Ethan's aging sedan, following them to a small, dim apartment complex miles away from the construction site. The drive was silent. Noah sat in the passenger seat, still weak. Ethan gripped the steering wheel, glancing at Daniel through the rearview mirror, unsure if this was real. Daniel stared out the window. The streets were modest. Worn sidewalks. Faded storefronts. This was not where Margaret deserved to be. When they reached the apartment, Daniel felt his chest tighten. Peeling paint. Rust on the railing. A final notice letter taped to the door. Ethan unlocked it quietly. The air inside was heavy. Dim. Margaret lay on a small couch pushed against the wall. Blankets tucked around her thin frame. Her breathing shallow. Machines none. Just pill bottles scattered on a nearby table. Daniel froze. 20 years disappeared instantly. He no longer saw a frail 65-year-old woman. He saw the 45-year-old widow standing in her kitchen, dividing rice into 4 plates. He saw her placing her hands on his head and blessing him. He walked slowly toward her. Margaret, he whispered. She didn't respond. Noah's voice cracked. She hasn't been fully conscious since yesterday. Daniel turned immediately. We're taking her now. Within minutes, his medical team arrived. Professional, efficient. They assessed her condition quickly. Blood pressure dangerously low. We need to move. They lifted her gently onto a stretcher. Ethan stood frozen. This feels like a dream, he murmured. Daniel placed a firm hand on his shoulder. No, he said softly, this is a promise. Margaret was airlifted to one of the best cancer treatment centers in the country. A private surgical oncology wing. Top specialists. Immediate imaging. Emergency pre-op procedures. The chief surgeon reviewed her scans. She's critical, he said carefully, but if we operate within hours, there's a fighting chance. Do it, Daniel replied without hesitation. Cost will be substantial. Daniel looked him in the eye. Her life is not a line item. Consent forms were signed. Pre-op preparations began. Ethan and Noah sat in a quiet surgical waiting room that felt worlds away from their apartment. Soft lighting. Comfortable chairs. Coffee machines they were too anxious to use. Noah whispered, why would he do this? Ethan stared ahead. Because Mom once did it for him. The surgery lasted 8 hours. 8 hours that felt like 8 lifetimes. Daniel didn't leave. He sat with the brothers. Not as a billionaire. Not as a CEO. But as someone who owed a debt of gratitude that money could never fully repay. He watched Ethan pace. He watched Noah silently cry. He remembered being 17 in a hospital hallway alone. He would not let them be alone. Finally, the surgeon emerged. Mask removed. Exhausted. The surgery was successful, he said. It was aggressive, but we removed the tumor. The next 24 hours are critical. Noah collapsed into a chair, sobbing openly. Ethan covered his face with his hands. Daniel closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. Thank you. Hours later in the ICU room, machines beeped steadily. Margaret lay still. Oxygen lines, IV drips, monitors glowing. Daniel stood quietly near the window. Ethan and Noah sat beside her. Then, a small movement. Her fingers twitched. Her eyelids fluttered. Noah shot up. Mom! Her eyes opened slowly. Clouded at first. Then focusing. She looked at Ethan. At Noah. And then, at Daniel. There was a long silence. Her gaze lingered. Confusion faded. Recognition dawned. Her eyes filled instantly. "Daniel," she whispered weakly. The sound of his name from her lips broke something deep inside him. He stepped closer, voice trembling. "Yes, it's me." Tears slid down her cheeks. "You came back." 3 words. Soft. Fragile. But they shattered every wall he had built around his heart. He dropped to his knees beside her bed. "I'm sorry it took so long," he said, voice breaking completely. "I should have found you sooner, I should have done more." She slowly lifted her weak hand. He took it gently. Her fingers were thin but still warm. "You were just a boy," she whispered, "and you kept your promise." He shook his head. "You saved me first." Her voice was faint but steady with emotion. "I didn't save you, Daniel, you saved yourself, I just reminded you who you were." Tears streamed freely now from Daniel, from her sons. She looked at Ethan and Noah. "I told you, kindness multiplies." Then she looked back at Daniel. "I never gave you food expecting this, I gave it because love is never wasted." He pressed her hand gently against his forehead, just as she once placed her hands on him. "I am everything because of you," he whispered. She smiled weakly. "No, you are everything because you chose to become a good man." Silence filled the room. Sacred. Heavy. Healing. Recovery was slow but steady. Daniel ensured the best post-operative care. Private room. Specialized nurses. Full oncology team. He never asked about cost again. Ethan and Noah barely recognized their life anymore. Within weeks, Margaret was transferred to a rehabilitation suite. The apartment lease was terminated. Daniel purchased a beautiful single-story home for them, accessible, peaceful, filled with sunlight. Medical expenses fully covered. A trust fund established for ongoing treatment. But he didn't stop there. He sat with Ethan one afternoon. "What did you want to study before you dropped out?" "Engineering," Ethan admitted quietly. Daniel smiled. "Then you'll finish. Full tuition paid. Housing covered." Noah had once wanted to study business management. "Then you'll run one," Daniel said. He funded a small logistics company under Noah's management, mentorship included. As for Margaret, once she regained strength, Daniel handed her documents. "What's this?" she asked. "A foundation," he said softly. "Margaret Hale Outreach, supporting widows and families facing medical crises." Her eyes filled again. "You named it after me." He nodded. "You taught me what real wealth is." She reached for his hand again. "Daniel." "Yes. I'm proud of you." The words he never got to hear from his own mother. In this time, he didn't hold back his tears. 3 months after the surgery, spring arrived gently. Margaret's new home sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees just beginning to bloom. The house Daniel bought for them wasn't a mansion, it wasn't meant to be. It was warm, peaceful. Sunlight poured through wide windows, the air smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. In the backyard, Daniel had insisted on planting a small garden. "Vegetables?" Noah had asked jokingly. "No," Daniel replied softly, "something that grows back." So they planted roses. Margaret loved roses. On a mild afternoon, Margaret sat outside wrapped in a light shawl. Her body was still fragile from surgery and ongoing treatment, but color had slowly returned to her cheeks. She looked thinner, but alive. Daniel sat across from her on a wooden bench. For a while, they simply listened to the wind move through the trees. Peace has a sound, it's quiet but it's powerful. Margaret broke the silence first. "You built quite a life," she said gently. Daniel gave a small smile. "I built companies," he replied. "I built buildings, I built contracts." He paused. "But I didn't build peace, not until now." She studied him carefully. "You carried guilt." It wasn't a question. He nodded slowly. "For 20 years. He looked down at his hands. "I thought success would erase the debt I felt, but the more I gained, the heavier it felt." Margaret leaned back slightly, her breathing steady but measured. "You were a boy trying to survive," she said softly. "You didn't owe me anything." Daniel's voice lowered. "I owed you everything." The breeze picked up slightly, rustling the roses. After a long pause, Margaret asked something unexpected. "Did you ever get angry?" He looked at her. "Angry?" At God, she clarified, for losing your father, for losing your mother, for having to grow up so quickly. The question hung in the air. Daniel stared toward the sky. I did, he admitted quietly. I was furious. I didn't understand why everything was taken from me so fast. He swallowed. I used to lie awake wondering why other kids had normal lives, why I had hospital bills. Margaret nodded. I asked the same question when Thomas died, she said. Silence followed. Then she continued. But over time I realized something. Daniel looked at her. Sometimes God doesn't remove the storm, she said softly. He sends someone to stand in it with you. The words hit him deeply. She continued. You lost your father, then your mother. I lost my husband. We didn't fix each other's pain, we just stood in it together. Daniel's eyes filled. I wouldn't have survived without you, he said. Margaret shook her head gently. You survived because you chose responsibility when you could have chosen resentment. That was always inside you. He leaned forward slightly. Why did you help us? He asked quietly. You barely had enough. Margaret smiled faintly. Because I knew what hunger felt like, not just food hunger but loneliness hunger. She looked at him tenderly. And I saw a boy trying to be a man too soon. Daniel's voice broke slightly. I remember the night you divided that rice. She laughed softly. It wasn't much rice. It was everything, he replied. Tears welled in her eyes again. I never expected you to come back, she admitted. I hoped you would succeed, but I didn't expect this. He reached over and gently held her hand. I searched, he said, for years, then life moved too fast. I regret that. She squeezed his fingers lightly. You came when it mattered. A long silence settled between them again. Peaceful. Then Margaret said something that caught him off guard. Do you know what I'm most proud of? He shook his head. Not the house, not the foundation, not the money. She looked directly into his eyes. I'm proud that you didn't just save me, you sat in the waiting room with my boys. Daniel felt his chest tighten. She continued. You didn't act like a billionaire, you acted like family. The word landed heavily. Family. Something he had lost so young. Daniel looked away, tears falling freely now. He hadn't heard that kind of affirmation since he was 17. Margaret gently reached up, placing her fragile hand against his cheek. You see, she said softly, kindness multiplies. A week later, Daniel made a quiet trip. No security detail. No cameras. No announcements. He drove alone to a modest neighborhood not far from where he once lived. In the back seat of his SUV were several grocery bags. Milk. Bread. Rice. Fresh vegetables. He parked discreetly near a small home with faded siding. He had seen a young mother earlier that week at a pharmacy counter, counting coins carefully before removing an item from her basket. He recognized that look. He walked up quietly. Left the groceries at the door. No note. No explanation. He knocked once and walked away before it opened. As he reached his car, he heard the door open. A soft gasp. Then a quiet voice. Oh my God. He didn't turn around. He simply got in his car and drove off. For the first time in decades, his chest felt light. Not because of profit. Not because of growth. But because the circle had closed. That evening he returned to Margaret's home. She was sitting by the window watching the sunset. He sat beside her quietly. I think, he said softly, I finally understand. Understand what? She asked. That wealth isn't what you keep, he replied, it's what you release. Margaret smiled gently. And what will you release next? Daniel looked out at the fading sky. Everything I can. The roses in the garden swayed gently in the evening breeze. And somewhere deep inside him, the 17-year-old boy who once went to bed hungry finally felt full. 5 years later, the name Margaret Hale Outreach Foundation became known in places no one expected. Not because of advertisements. Not because of press conferences. But because of stories. Stories of widows who received rent assistance when eviction felt certain. Stories of fathers who could afford surgery for their children. Stories of families who opened their doors to find groceries they didn't know how they would afford. Daniel never allowed the foundation to carry his name. When reporters asked why, he would simply say, "Some heroes never intended to be known." Margaret's health improved slowly after surgery and treatment. The cancer never fully defined her. She spent her days mentoring younger widows through the foundation, sitting across from them at tables just like the one where she once divided her last meal. Ethan finished his engineering degree with honors. Noah grew the logistics company into a thriving regional operation, employing dozens, many of them young men who had once been forced to drop out of school like he did. And every year, on the anniversary of Daniel's mother's passing, they gathered together. Not in a boardroom, not at a gala, but in the garden, where the roses bloomed faithfully each spring. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Margaret looked at Daniel and said softly, "You see what one small act can do?" He nodded. He understood now. Kindness is rarely loud. It doesn't trend. It doesn't announce itself. It simply moves quietly from one life to another, and then multiplies in ways no one can measure. Daniel often thought about that night when he was 17, the night he watched a widow divide almost nothing into something for someone else. That moment didn't just feed his body. It shaped his character. It redirected his future. It built a billionaire who understood that wealth without compassion is poverty in disguise. Before Margaret passed peacefully years later, surrounded by her sons and the boy she once fed, she whispered one final truth. Never underestimate what love can grow. Daniel carried those words with him long after the garden grew quiet. And whenever he was asked the secret to his success, he never mentioned strategy, risk tolerance, or timing. He simply said, "I was hungry once and someone shared." Success is not measured by what you accumulate, but by what you give. The smallest act of kindness can outlive money, power, and even time. When you stand in someone's storm, you may become the reason they survive it. And sometimes, the promise you make in pain becomes the purpose you live in prosperity. Because in the end, kindness doesn't just multiply. It returns. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Galatians 6 verses 9. Before you go, I want you to think about this. Has someone ever shown you kindness when you had nothing? If this story touched your heart, leave a comment and tell me, because your story might encourage someone else tonight. And if you believe promises matter, if you believe kindness always comes back, subscribe.